But one of the gravest threats, as I see it, doesn't come from rain or fire or drought, but from the very depths of the human heart. We have the capacity to be kind, loving, generous, and compassionate, but these traits are most readily on display when we have what we need and live in safety. And unfortunately, humans tend to be protective, and when mass migration butts up against a rising tide of nationalism, what does that mean for us as individuals and members of society? Will we become the monster we fear, or will we reach for our higher being? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to one of the last talks on the last day of COP26 here in Glasgow. My name is Regina Valdez. I'm the Program Director for Climate Reality Project in New York City and also a Green Faith Fellow. Tonight we're discussing eco-migration, the forcing of millions from their homes. So there's been a lot of discussion here and worldwide whether these talks will come to any meaningful conclusion. But whatever the outcome, what's all but certain is global powers will continue to emit greenhouse gases and our planet will continue to warm. What that means is water levels will continue to rise, fires will continue to burn, crops will wither in fields, and humans, desperate for a place to live and food to eat, will continue to be forced from their homes. It is estimated that in the very near future, climate change will force over 1 million climate migrants out of Central America to the US border each year. Globally, the number of people expected to be displaced due to climate change will grow. The UN estimates that there were 30 million people displaced in 2020, and the World Bank estimates that by 2050, there will be 150 million people displaced due directly to climate change. Now, they may seem high, these numbers, but in actuality, they're really quite low. And last year, in the National Academy of Sciences, they published a study suggesting that by 2050, upwards of 1/3 of the Earth's population will face the decision of moving due to climate changes. And you may wonder who some of these climate migrants are. Here you see some climate migrants being forced from their homes due to flooding. But in reality, there are many different examples, including the upper middle class family in Northern California that decamps to Austin, Texas to get away from bad air quality and the threat of ever more fires. A Guatemalan family whose subsistence farm suffered crop failures for the last 3 years, or an entire Dutch community planning to leave the Netherlands due to rising sea levels. Now, in the United States alone, an estimated 13 million coastal residents are expected to be displaced by 2100 due to sea level rise. So if you do the math, that equates to over 150,000 a year beginning last year. And of course, numbers precipitously rising as we get closer to 2100. And meanwhile, hundreds of Californians were forced to relocate during the fires of 2020 and this year. And many moved permanently. In Oregon, more than 500,000 were put under mandatory evacuation orders. Now, I've only mentioned fires in the United States, but here's a depiction of wildfires around the world from last year and this year. So imagine dozens of Californias burning the world over, and many hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. So of course, increasing fires is one aspect of climate change, but what about flooding? So we all remember the dramatic flooding that took place in Europe this year, and the images of Germany underwater are practically engraved in our minds. Flooding also affected untold numbers in China. But what about in countries where social safety networks are less able to support those who are poor and with few options? In India, just a few days ago, and barely mentioned in this COP, over 10,000 people in Tamil Nadu were displaced from their homes due to flooding, and over 5,000 in Sri Lanka. But one of the gravest threats, as I see it, doesn't come from rain or fire or drought, but from the very depths of the human heart. We have the capacity to be kind, loving, generous, and compassionate, but these traits are most readily on display when we have what we need and live in safety. And unfortunately, humans tend to be protective, and when mass migration butts up against a rising tide of nationalism, what does that mean for us as individuals and members of society? Will we become the monster we fear, or will we reach for our higher being? It has been suggested that climate change is not a problem to be solved so much as a call to being something other than what we are. And I'm hoping that that goal, at least, is still within reach. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dan Galpern. Dan is founder and executive director and general counsel to the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, a U.S. nonprofit organization. He has served as legal policy advisor, to climate scientist Dr. James Hansen since 2011. And prior to the law, Dan worked for 20 years as public interest analyst and advocate for human rights and global security. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Dan.
Thank you, Regina. I'm going to pick up on your point that we should be more than who we normally think we are. And in particular, I wish to urge the highly vulnerable nations to stand up and to address the climate crisis. And so I here direct my statement principally to leaders and activists from the global south, including from Africa and South Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and island nations. We're here now nearing the close of this, the 26th COP. And still, despite these 26 conferences, and notwithstanding that we're edging up to the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there is still no binding plan. And there will be no enforceable agreement this year at COP to timely phase out fossil fuel emissions and to draw down excess atmospheric CO2. In that I sorely wish that I were wrong, because these two developments, a timely phase out of fossil fuel emissions and removal of the excess, are absolutely crucial for the survival of our civilization. By these measures, then, this COP has failed. Whether that failure is abject is another question, but certainly the case could be made. The Paris Agreement, of course, does not even mention the term fossil fuels or fossil fuel industry. And there's nothing in the Framework Convention that assigns liability to those who have laughed it up all the way to the bank by their ability to continue to treat our common atmosphere as an open sewer for their pollution. But there is relevant law outside of those two documents. And yet the full potential of that law to address this crisis is almost entirely untapped. We can continue to leave it untapped, but only at the peril of our children and their progeny. This panel is convened in part to consider the fundamental injustice that many of our brothers and sisters who have contributed least to global climate change are first or hardest hit by its effects. But in consideration of the science, of the dramatic impacts that have already occurred, and of the fact that far, far worse is yet to come, a continued failure to take meaningful action should now be deemed unacceptable. And so, I urge you to be dissatisfied, in particular, dissatisfied even with the dramatic increase in loss and damage funding and adaptation funding, because these are, in fact, no better than mowing the lawn. They fail to get at the underlying problem that today threatens your people and tomorrow threatens the entire planet. Loss and damage funding, along with adaptation funding, these do nothing to address the underlying issue, as it provides little to no incentive for Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP, Total, and the rest of them to fundamentally alter their determination to drill, pump, and refine until the very last reserves are tapped. This funding, that is, if it materializes, stems from the puppet states, but not from their masters. And as such, although the funding may be critical to address near-term conditions, it does nothing to induce the changes that are required. And of course, the funds will not be spent to limit global warming or ocean acidification, nor to reverse their trends. I also urge you, for that matter, to be dissatisfied with recurrent plans to seek a non-binding advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice via referral to the General Assembly. Whatever that initiative's potential utility, it cannot suffice because, again, almost by definition, it leaves untouched the authority of the carbon majors to continue to exploit and pollute our common atmosphere and to do nothing to clean up their mess. Now, I understand it may seem daunting for a small nation, or for that matter, a member of civil society, to go up against the major fossil fuel corporations, that is, to demand that they clean up their mess. But, depending on the law of a considered jurisdiction, that in fact remains your right. And indeed, those who are most vulnerable to present impacts are those who are best situated in terms of the facts and the law to demand in civil court a fundamental redirection. The major polluters can and should be forced to clean up their mess. My colleagues and I are determined to help ensure that this might be done before it's entirely too late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that impassioned plea for nations to seek the justice that they so richly deserve. Next on our panel is Raya Salter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Raya Salter. I'm an energy and climate attorney based in New York City. I've been an attorney for the Environmental Defense Fund, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and we act for environmental justice. And I'm really pleased to talk a bit about what's going on with climate justice and climate debt and climate migration in the context of COP26. Now, what is at stake? You know, as we know, climate change by 2050 could displace as many as 1 billion people. And of course, those in the small island developing states are absolutely the most at risk. I have to bring up, if you were here today at all, you heard folks walking out of the people's session in the plenary screaming, "We want climate justice. We want climate justice now." That is the mood here at the COP. There's a big push for climate justice, and I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means from the UNFCCC perspective. So indeed, the small island developing nations have really been at the forefront of advocacy, and this is just one reason why you can see why. This is just a picture of the Maldives. The Maldives is no greater than 1 meter above sea level. It's a long, flat place. You can imagine living in an island with that close above sea level, that 1 meter means complete submersion. Another nation that's been at the forefront of climate justice, this is the Marshall Islands. You can see the intense vulnerability. And in fact, by 2100, it's estimated that about 77% of the population of the Marshall Islands are likely to be displaced. So we're looking at very near-term displacement. So what is climate justice? So this is the concept that the global north has incurred a climate debt for its historic and current contributions to climate change. And what creates this idea in the UN framework of climate debt? There are two things that sort of underlie this concept. One is the polluter pays principle. Those who have caused the harm are implicated to repatriate it. And state responsibility for transboundary harm. So these two concepts really underlie the idea that the global north, because of its outsized contributions, has a climate debt. So where do we start seeing, you have these small island states, other groups in the global south, advocating for this climate debt principle. So where you start seeing it show up is in 1992, when Article 3.1 of the UNFCCC directs the global north to take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects. So What is loss and damage? You heard my colleague mention loss and damage. I don't think that mitigation and loss and damage are mutually exclusive. But this has been the primary rallying cry for the Global South, small island developing states, loss and damage. This showed up for the first time in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, this idea that had been long advocated for loss and damage. Recognizes loss and damage and instructs a previously created committee to create a task force to develop recommendations for approaches to minimize and address displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change. So this is something aside from adaptation funding, this idea of loss and damage. How are we, those in the global north, going to make whole those who are losing their homes and lives and very nations due to climate change when they have done the absolute least to contribute to it? So where are we now with loss and damage? You see, this Times article was just from yesterday. And you saw, if you were here today at all again, you saw that march outside of the plenary. We want climate justice now. What are folks asking for? Loss and damage. Who does not want loss and damage? Well, it makes sense, right? The wealthier nations, the United States, Great Britain. Why? Because that creates a liability, a fundamental existential threat of liability. But the Global South is calling for a mechanism that will include loss and damage. So that is exactly where we are right now. We are waiting to see what happens, what will happen by the end of the COP. Will there be a fund created to address loss and damage, something different from adaptation, something different from mitigation, and this would address irreparable losses caused by historic harm, which happens when you lose your culture, your territory, and your entire ecosystem as there. It is likely to happen in the Marshall Islands. So I hope that's been a helpful context for COP, and I will toss it back to Regina.
Thank you so much, Raya, and thank you for your introduction. But I do want to add to that that you are also the author of the book Energy Justice,
Yes.
U.S. and International Perspectives.
Thank you very much.
You're so very welcome. Next on our panel is Paul Beckwith, and Paul is a climate system scientist who has taught at the University of Ottawa and the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology, as well as at Carleton University. He is a well-known climate educator, and on YouTube has over 1,000 videos pertaining to climate change. So, Paul, your thoughts on eco-migration?
Yes, thank you, Regina. So, first of all, I want to remind people that it's not just humans that are undergoing migration. We're getting migration of plants and animals, flora and fauna. For example, when there's a wildfire that goes through a tropical forest or any forest, boreal forest, and completely burns it down to the ground, we cannot assume that the same thing will grow in its place, that a new forest will grow. The climate has shifted and become much drier with less precipitation, much hotter. We're more likely to get a grassland growing in that location or savanna, depending on the climate. So there is migration of plants. We don't think of it, but the way pollen is spread and the way that forests regrow and things, we're getting changes in species mix. Just to give you an idea, parts of Siberia that were a decade ago just shrublands, the tallest plants were shrubs. There's now forests of 6 or 8 foot tall larch trees, for example, and other species that have grown because it's a much warmer environment conducive to that. Animals are migrating to the poles to colder, more familiar environments. Most animal species live in a niche where they can live within a certain temperature range and precipitation range. And if the environment is changing underneath them where they are, then they move generally to the poles to get colder areas, or in the case of fish, maybe deeper down. But of course, species are being squeezed out. For example, the cod are migrating north to colder waters because the waters where they are too warm. Meanwhile, when they go north, the salinity changes are The oceans are less salty because of the sea ice melt and glacier melt, and that's no good for the cod, so they can eventually, they'll probably be squeezed out and disappear if we continue on the way we're going. So, I'll give some examples of places where, that particularly stick out in terms of migration for me. So, Paradise, California, okay? The town burned down a couple of years ago. Most of the people moved east to a larger city called Chico, California. The people in Chico welcomed them. They provided food and tents and clothes for them. But 2 years later, they were still there. So the town basically took away the tents that they'd given them and took away, made them unwelcome, basically drove them out, said you can't be here anymore. They were occupying public spaces, so the welcome was worn out. And we're going to see this happening more and more often. Katrina, of course, is a great example. The city of New Orleans was evacuated. Many people went to Houston. Many, many people that moved out of New Orleans have never returned. They've stayed in Houston. Meanwhile, after Katrina, Houston has been hit a few times by strong hurricanes, flooding the city and further displacing these people. So they go from one place, disaster, to another place, to another place. They become much more like nomads, if you like. And of course, probably the most well-known example, or it should be, but it's probably not, is the Somali situation. They had a record 1 in 1,000-year drought for 2006 to 2010. 1.5 million farmers, in Syria, okay? Syria. So they had, all these people lost their jobs and livelihoods, and they had to migrate to the cities. No jobs there, not enough jobs. There was strife, civil war broke out, unrest, refugees all over the world, including many to Canada, where I am. So, it's hitting people all over. The bottom line is we each have to choose carefully, very carefully, where we live now. In terms of, and if you're in a place where your house gets flooded out, you have to really ask yourself, why should you not expect a similar flood to come along in a few years? So why would you even want to stay there? The German flooding that Regina was talking about, it wiped out many houses and buildings along rivers in Germany due to unprecedented rainfall. Many of those houses and structures were hundreds of years old. So they've been standing there for hundreds of years, and now the climate has changed so much that a flood basically takes them out. So you really have to ask yourself, why would you want to live there? I mean, people are being driven from their homes by floods, by wildfires, by droughts. If you live on the coast, by storm surges from large superstorm, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, whatever you want to call it, depending on where you are in the world. Also, there's a lot of political instability that is directly resulting from the rapid changes in the climate, and that's also another consideration as to where to live. So just come to Canada, maybe. Or, you have to seriously look at what countries are faring, are most able to fare the best. And I would say, countries, I'm very lucky in Canada. We have a very low population density. We have lots of fresh water. We have lots of space. We can always move further north. I fully expect that many Americans from the Southwest, for example, will migrate up north to Canada. Maybe some of those big pipeline infrastructure will be piping water eventually south from Canada. So, things are quickly going out of norms, out of, the 1 in 100-year, 1 in 1,000-year events when they happen every few years. Clearly the weather system is not recognizable. We're getting weather weirding, weather wilding, weather whiplashing, where we go from one state to another state, like drought to flooding, and then back to drought. So all of these things, all of these events are gravely affecting us all, and we all live on this planet. None of us can escape this, but people get it to different degrees depending on where they are.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for that ad for Canada. I appreciate that you brought up that humans, Homo sapiens, is not the only species affected by climate migration. And I also recognize that while many of us can choose where to live and try to map out the safest place, many billions don't have that luxury. And that brings to mind this whole issue of loss and damage suffered by the Global South, perpetrated by the, it's hard to say perpetrated by the Global North, but yes, and the multinational fossil fuel industry. And I'm just wondering, in terms of climate reparations, I mean, how possible is it that we will actually see anything like this enacted? And if so, where will that money come from? And I would love to pose that to both of you, I guess starting with Raya and then Dan.
Yeah, well, we are, I mean, as we speak, literally as we speak, in one of these rooms here, members of the Global South are furiously negotiating to see some type of loss and damage provision. And how that could show up is in the agreed upon framework, even the mention of, urging, and recognizing, the concept would be, and that there should be some type of fund, would be progress on that front. And I would expect that it would, like other funds that have been collected or come up with from the Global North, that this would be similar. But the key would be that this is different from other funds for clean energy, for funds to development, or funds for adaptation, something specific to cover historic loss and damage.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, they have not funded the Warsaw mechanism, the loss and damage mechanism, for nearly as much as was anticipated, which was supposed to be $100 billion a year. But then they're talking about this other huge pot of funds that are necessary, I think, to deal with anticipated or virtually certain future loss and damage since we have not arrested global climate change. I think it's certainly just and necessary, but I also think that we need to be doing a lot more. I mean, remember, it was Tony de Bruijn, the former foreign minister of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, along with Kathy Kitchener, who during the conference that led to the Paris Accord, who came up with the campaign 1.5 to stay alive. And I think that unless we can figure out a way to markedly take down the fossil fuel industry and reduce emissions and start to remove additional atmospheric CO2, all of these efforts will be swamped because of, again, it'll be like mowing the lawn. We need to get back and figure out some way of, quelling this global
Yeah, but
warming.
loss and damage is not mutually exclusive to, to mitigation and adaptation at all. That's something I don't
I agree.
fully-
I agree entirely. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So I guess what I'm hearing is we will have to wait and see how these talks
Very
net out.
soon, very
Right,
soon.
right. Well, I want to thank you all for being on this panel and discussing this very important topic of eco-migration. And I do, again, want to thank you all for being here. And I also want to thank the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, the International Society for Ecological Economics, the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, and the Sustainable Population Australia for allowing us to be here and discuss this topic with you. So thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.